Clara adjusted the straps of her worn travel bag and peered out at the endless expanse of dry, rolling hills. The sun had begun its slow descent behind jagged mountains, painting the sky in streaks of gold and amber, but instead of awe, she felt a tightening in her chest. Her journey had been long and grueling days of rattling along the stagecoach trails, nights spent in drafty inns filled with the scent of horses and unwashed travelers, and now this final stretch seemed almost unbearable. She clutched the letter that had set her on this path, the letter from her future in-laws, and her heart fluttered with nervous anticipation. According to the instructions, she was to meet her fiancé at the Blackwood Ranch, a sprawling estate in the northern valley where she would begin her new life as a wife. But as she walked down the narrow dirt path leading to the ranch house in the distance, something felt off. The fence posts were rough-hewn, uneven, and the house itself, a squat wooden structure, looked nothing like the elegant manner described in the letter. Panic prickled at the edges of her nerves. Could the directions have been wrong? She stopped, took a deep breath, and reminded herself to remain calm. After all, she had always been taught that grace under pressure was a woman's greatest asset. When she finally reached the porch and lifted the latch of the heavy wooden door, it creaked ominously. A man appeared, broad-shouldered and sun-weathered, his expression unreadable. He was rough around the edges, with a thick beard streaked with gray and hands calloused from years of labor. Clara's stomach tightened as she attempted a polite greeting. "Good evening. I believe I'm here to meet Mr. Blackwood." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, a mixture of suspicion and irritation. "Blackwood?" he repeated, his voice deep and cautious. "There ain't no one expecting a bride here. Name's Jacob Hartwell." "You must be mistaken." Clara felt a rush of embarrassment and confusion. "But the letter I was told to come here. My fiancé, he sent for me." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying her anxiety. She took a step forward, hoping her explanation would clear the misunderstanding, but the man crossed his arms and shook his head. "You're a long way from the right ranch, miss. Ain't no one sending for a bride here." Her heart sank. She had traveled so far, endured so much, and now it seemed that all her preparations, all her dreams of meeting her future husband and beginning a new life, were in vain. Clara struggled to steady herself, swallowing her disappointment and trying to think logically. The night was coming fast, and she had nowhere else to go. The thought of sleeping outdoors on the uneven ground made her shiver, but she didn't want to impose on a stranger. Then she heard a quiet, almost timid voice behind her. "God finally sent you to us." Clara turned to see a small girl peeking out from behind the man's legs. The child's eyes were wide, filled with something tender and hopeful. She clutched a worn doll to her chest, but her gaze never left Clara. Something about the girl's presence was disarming, almost magical in its simplicity. Despite the confusion and fear gnawing at her, Clara felt a spark of warmth. For the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps, she thought, even a mistake could lead to something meaningful. With a deep breath, she decided she would stay at least for the night. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with courage, for the sake of the mysterious little girl who had whispered such words of hope and for the promise of discovering what fate had in store. Jacob Hartwell wiped the sweat from his brow and stepped back to survey the small herd grazing near the edge of the valley. The late afternoon sun burned low, casting long shadows across the dry earth, and the wind carried the scent of dust, hay, and distant pine. Life on the Hartwell Ranch had never been easy, but after the death of his wife 3 years ago, it had become a relentless cycle of work and quiet solitude. Every day was a careful balance of tending to the land, the animals, and his little daughter, Lily. She was bright and resilient, but she was also painfully aware of the absence of her mother, and Jacob had grown protective, wary of anyone who might disrupt the fragile equilibrium they had established. The sudden arrival of Clara earlier that evening had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The way she had appeared on his porch, flustered and polite, carrying her bags and an air of nervous determination, had been startling enough. But it was the child's words that lingered in his mind. Lily, his small, cautious daughter, had whispered, "God finally sent you to us." He hadn't expected her to speak so openly to a stranger, and yet there had been no fear in her eyes, only hope, a hope that unsettled Jacob more than he realized. Jacob had returned to the cabin after tending the cattle, trying to ignore the knot of uncertainty in his chest. He knew the rules of the land. Strangers were treated with suspicion, and trust was earned, not given. Clara's presence defied all those rules. She was not the bride he had been promised, if there had ever been one. She was a stranger, an unknown factor in the carefully controlled life he had built for himself and Lily. And yet, there was something undeniably compelling about her, a mixture of vulnerability and quiet strength. Sitting at the edge of the porch, Jacob listened as Lily whispered to herself, recounting every detail of Clara's arrival. Her tiny hands gripped her doll tightly, and her eyes sparkled with an unusual excitement. Jacob's heart ached for her. He had always shielded Lily from disappointment, from the harshness of life. And yet, here was this unexpected guest bringing a glimmer of joy into her small world. Jacob leaned back against the railing, arms crossed, trying to steady his thoughts. He had faced many challenges as a rancher, but none like this. A stranger beautiful, polite, seemingly gentle, was now tied to his daughter's happiness and, by extension, to his own. He knew he could not simply send her away without thought. The night was falling, and Clara had nowhere else to go. Even if he wanted to protect his routines and his solitary life, his sense of decency would not allow him to turn her out. As the sky deepened to indigo, Jacob called Lily inside, his voice calm but firm. He watched Clara approach the cabin, noticing the hesitation in her step, the way she carried herself as though uncertain of every move. The sight stirred something within him he hadn't felt in years, a quiet curiosity, the faintest hint of hope that perhaps life could surprise him in ways he had long since stopped expecting. That night, as the wind whispered through the trees and the stars emerged in the clear sky, Jacob lay awake on the edge of his bed, thinking about the day's events. Clara's arrival was a mistake, yes, but one that refused to be ignored. He felt a strange mixture of apprehension and anticipation. Tomorrow he would have to decide how to navigate this new presence in their lives. For now, though, he simply listened to the soft, rhythmic breathing of his daughter and allowed himself the smallest, most reluctant acknowledgement. Perhaps, just perhaps, fate had sent them someone they never expected. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the Hartwell cabin, casting slanted golden beams across the rough wooden floor. Clara stirred, the memory of the previous evening still fresh, the strange welcome, the little girl's whisper, and the wary gaze of the rancher, Jacob Hartwell. She rose quietly, not wanting to disturb Lily, who lay curled under a patchwork quilt, still half asleep. Her heart pounded with apprehension. She had no idea what the day would bring. Would Jacob insist she leave? Or would he tolerate her presence, however reluctantly? Jacob was already up, moving about with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to early mornings and hard labor. The scent of coffee and freshly baked bread from the small stove drifted through the cabin. Clara's stomach tightened as she watched him work, noting the tension in his broad shoulders, the guarded way he measured each movement. It was clear he had been taken aback by her sudden arrival, and she knew that breaking through his reserve would be no easy task. After a tense breakfast, Clara decided to address the situation directly. "Mr. Hartwell," she began cautiously, "I know there's been a mix-up. I wasn't supposed to come here. But I had nowhere else to go last night. I only meant to be respectful. I don't want to intrude." Jacob paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered her words. "You don't understand, miss. This ranch, my daughter, my life, they don't run on mistakes," You show up and everything changes. And I don't take kindly to strangers stepping in uninvited. Clara felt the sting of his bluntness, but she held her ground, straightening her shoulders. I know. I only ask for a chance to explain, maybe even help. I care about children, and I know your daughter needs care and stability. I didn't come here to cause trouble. Jacob's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained cautious. Lily doesn't need fancy words or promises, Miss Clara. She needs trust. And trust isn't given lightly around here, not to outsiders. The tension between them hung heavy in the air. Clara's heart ached as she watched Lily peek from behind the doorway, her small face curious yet cautious. The little girl's faith in Clara unsettled Jacob, a reminder that this was not just about him or his stubborn pride. He saw the spark of hope in Lily's eyes, the way she clung to the possibility of something new, and he knew he couldn't simply dismiss it. Still, Jacob was a man of principles and routine. The ranch was harsh, the work relentless, and he could not allow sentiment alone to disrupt the life he had built for himself and his daughter. Look, he said finally, I'll give you a place to stay for now. But don't think this means you belong here. You follow the rules of the ranch. You work, you earn your keep, and you respect my daughter. That's all I ask, Clara nodded, relief flooding through her. Thank you, Mr. Hartwell. I promise I'll do my best. Even as they settled into the uneasy truce, a current of unspoken emotion flowed between them. Jacob couldn't ignore the curiosity, the subtle admiration creeping into his thoughts, nor could Clara suppress the flicker of hope that perhaps she had found not just shelter, but a chance to belong. Lily, sensing the fragile agreement, tentatively reached for Clara's hand, her small fingers entwining with hers. The gesture, simple yet profound, sent warmth through Clara's chest and forced a reluctant acknowledgement from Jacob. The day's events were more than a mere coincidence. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the ranch bustled with the rhythm of chores, feeding cattle, mending fences, fetching water. Clara fumbled at first, clumsy and unpracticed, yet she persisted, determined to prove herself. Jacob watched, critical yet increasingly impressed by her effort. The initial tension remained, but underneath it, a seed of understanding and respect was beginning to take root, fragile but unmistakable. The following morning dawned crisp and quiet, the kind of silence only the wide-open ranchlands could offer. Clara had been awake early, helping Lily prepare a small breakfast of porridge and bread. The little girl's movements were slow but deliberate, and Clara watched her with a mixture of admiration and concern. Lily had endured so much in her short life, yet there was a resilience and gentleness about her that struck Clara deeply. She wanted more than anything to nurture that spirit, to make the girl feel safe and loved again. Jacob entered the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee trailing behind him, and cast a measured glance at Clara and Lily. His jaw was set, his posture rigid. Though he had allowed Clara to stay, he remained cautious, unwilling to let his guard down too quickly. Yet, as he watched Lily interact with her, he felt a subtle shift inside, a whisper of something he hadn't felt in years, something he wasn't ready to name. After breakfast, Lily lingered near Clara, twirling a lock of hair around her small fingers. She had been watching the exchange between the two adults for days, sensing the tension, the restraint, and the cautious politeness that veiled their true emotions. Finally, she could no longer keep her thoughts to herself. In a soft voice, barely audible above the hum of the wind through the cabin windows, she whispered, "God finally sent you to us." Clara froze, her hand resting gently on Lily's small shoulder. The words were simple, but their weight was immense. They conveyed hope, acceptance, and a sense of divine timing that touched Clara in a way nothing else had during her long, uncertain journey. She bent down to meet Lily's gaze. "Do you really mean that?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. The little girl nodded, her eyes wide and sincere. "I've been waiting for someone kind," she said. Someone who would help take care of me. And my papa. Jacob, who had been moving to start the morning chores, stopped mid-step, the words reaching him with a force that made him pause. He glanced at his daughter and then at Clara and felt a knot of conflicting emotions twist in his chest. He had spent years shielding Lily from disappointment, keeping her hopes tethered to reality. Yet here was this stranger, this accidental bride, eliciting a pure, unguarded belief in a better future. He cleared his throat, trying to mask the stirrings of his own heart. "Lily," he said firmly, "we can't just—" "Papa," Lily interrupted, tugging gently at his sleeve. "She's not just anyone. She's the one God sent. Don't you feel it?" Jacob looked down at his daughter, then back at Clara, whose eyes reflected both surprise and a quiet determination. He had to admit it. There was something about her that didn't just belong to the ranch, but to their small, fragile family. The thought unsettled him, yet also intrigued him, challenging the walls he had built around his heart. For the rest of the morning, Clara and Lily moved through the chores together, feeding chickens, brushing the horses, and gathering water from the well. Each time Clara paused, unsure of herself, Lily offered gentle guidance, reinforcing the trust she had placed in this new presence. Jacob watched from a distance, silently noting the bond forming before his eyes. The tension of the past days seemed to melt slightly, replaced by a sense of cautious hope. By noon, Jacob finally approached Clara, his voice measured but less rigid than before. You handled yourself well this morning," he said. "Seems Lily's faith in you might not be entirely misplaced." Clara smiled, warmth flooding her chest. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time she felt a sense of belonging, a thread of connection weaving between her, the little girl, and even the wary rancher. And though Jacob did not yet fully admit it, the whisper of a future none of them could have planned began to take root in the vast, untamed land around them. The next few days on the Hartwell Ranch settled into a rhythm, though it was a rhythm foreign to Clara. She had never imagined her mornings would begin before sunrise, her hands calloused from hauling water and feeding livestock, her clothes stiff from the dust of the land. Yet there was a strange satisfaction in the labor, a grounding that reminded her she was alive, that she could be useful, and that she could make a difference in the lives of those around her. Jacob observed her quietly, his arms crossed as he surveyed her attempts to master tasks he had performed effortlessly for years. Clara was clumsy at first. She spilled water from the well, dropped a sack of feed, and nearly startled the horses into a panic when she approached too quickly. Jacob's sharp eyes followed each misstep, but beneath his stern exterior, a grudging respect began to form. She did not complain, she did not falter in spirit, and her willingness to keep learning impressed him. Lily, of course, was Clara's greatest cheerleader. The little girl would scurry alongside her, offering gentle instructions or a reassuring smile whenever she faltered. "Like this," Lily would say, holding a chicken under one arm as she demonstrated, or "try lifting it this way," when Clara struggled with a heavy bale of hay. Their bond deepened quickly, a combination of shared effort, trust, and the mutual desire for connection. Jacob, initially distant, found himself watching the two of them more often than he cared to admit. He noted how Clara's face would flush with determination when she tackled a particularly difficult task, or how her laughter would ring out unexpectedly when Lily said something witty or innocent. It was a sound that reminded him of joy, something he had buried under years of responsibility and grief. One afternoon, as the sun blazed high in the sky, Clara struggled to repair a broken fence post. Her hands were raw, her shirt streaked with sweat and dust, yet she pressed on, determined not to fail. Jacob approached, his usual stern expression softened. "Here," he said, kneeling beside her, "you're doing it wrong. Let me show you." His hands, rough from years of labor, moved with precision, guiding hers. Clara felt the subtle warmth of connection, the silent acknowledgement of respect passing between them. By evening, the ranch had taken on the familiar rhythm of completion: livestock fed, fences repaired, meals prepared. Clara and Lily worked together to sweep the cabin floor and set the table, while Jacob leaned against the doorway, observing. The tension that had hung so heavily in the first days was loosening, replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding. Clara was no longer just a stranger. She was part of their daily life, part of the rhythm that held the Hartwell Ranch together. Yet challenges remained. The work was exhausting, the isolation of the ranch pressing in at times, and Jacob's guarded nature meant that acceptance was never fully assured. Clara had to navigate not only the physical labor, but also the subtle emotional landscape, learning when to offer help and when to step back, sensing when to speak and when to remain silent. Each small success, repairing a fence, calming a frightened horse, earning a nod of approval from Jacob, was a victory, a step toward becoming more than a visitor, toward becoming part of a family. At night, after the chores were done and Lily had been tucked into bed, Clara would sit by the small stove, reflecting on the day. Exhausted, yet satisfied, she allowed herself a small, private smile. Life at the Hartwell Ranch was hard, unpredictable, and sometimes frightening, but it was honest and it was real. And for the first time since her long journey began, she felt a sense of belonging, however, tentative, and the quiet hope that perhaps she had arrived not at the wrong ranch at all, but at exactly the place she was meant to be. As the days stretched into weeks, Clara began to settle into life on the Hartwell Ranch, and the initial awkwardness between her and Jacob slowly transformed into something more nuanced. The tension that had marked their first meetings gave way to small moments of understanding, mutual respect, and the beginnings of trust. Each sunrise brought new chores, new challenges, and new opportunities to see each other not just as strangers, but as people with histories, burdens, and the capacity for connection. Jacob watched her carefully as she tended to the horses, noticing the way her hands moved hesitantly at first, then with increasing confidence. She listened attentively to his instructions, yet she didn't blindly follow. She asked questions, offered suggestions, and occasionally laughed at her own mistakes. Jacob had long since grown accustomed to solitary labor, and the presence of someone who could challenge him, even gently, was disarming. He realized he was learning from her too, her patience, her empathy, her ability to see people, not just problems. Lily, of course, thrived in this environment. The little girl's laughter became a common sound around the ranch, and Clara's influence was undeniable. Together, they planted a small garden, painted the porch swing, and even read together in the evenings. Each shared activity deepened their bond, and Jacob noticed with quiet amazement how Clara's care seemed to awaken a joy in Lily that had been subdued since her mother's death. There were moments, too, where Jacob saw another side of Clara, her vulnerability, her longing for a life that had been mapped out by circumstances beyond her control. One evening, after a long day of tending the fields, Clara confided in him about her journey, about the confusion and fear she had felt when she realized she had arrived at the wrong ranch. "I thought I had failed before I even began," she admitted softly. "But then I met Lily, and something told me I belonged here even if I wasn't supposed to." Jacob's heart tightened at her words. He wasn't used to speaking about feelings, least of all to a stranger, but something in Clara's honesty invited his own reflection. He realized that, like her, he had been living cautiously, protecting himself and his daughter from disappointment. Yet now, with her presence, he was beginning to imagine a life that included hope, laughter, and perhaps even love. Their days became punctuated by small but meaningful gestures. Jacob would quietly bring Clara a cup of coffee in the early morning light, or pause to watch her with Lily in the fields, marveling at the ease with which they worked together. Clara, in turn, began to anticipate his needs, offering a hand when a fence post was stubborn, keeping track of schedules, or leaving a hot meal on the table after a long day of labor. Their relationship was no longer defined solely by words, but by shared effort and silent understanding. Evenings on the ranch became times of reflection and subtle intimacy. Sitting by the fireplace after dinner, they would exchange stories. Jacob about the challenges of maintaining the ranch alone, Clara about her family and the life she had left behind. The walls of caution that Jacob had carefully built began to crack, and Clara's presence, steady and kind, became a balm to the loneliness that had long marked their lives. Yet beneath the growing trust and respect, an undercurrent of unspoken emotion began to swell. Jacob found himself drawn to Clara's resilience, her gentle humor, and the way she naturally cared for his daughter. Clara, too, felt the pull of something more than gratitude and admiration for his strength, his protectiveness, and the rare tenderness he reserved for Lily. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the ranch in gold and shadow, the three of them, rancher, little girl, and unexpected bride, had begun to form a quiet, fragile family. The seed of connection had been planted, nurtured by shared labor, laughter, and trust. And though neither Jacob nor Clara fully understood where it would lead, both sensed that life on the Hartwell Ranch was no longer merely about survival, it was about belonging. The tranquility of the Hartwell Ranch was shattered one late afternoon by an unsettling tension that even the wide, open landscape could not disguise. Clara had been hauling firewood with Lily at her side when she noticed Jacob riding toward them at a full gallop, his face grim. The horses kicked up dust, their hooves pounding against the dry earth, and Clara felt a shiver of unease run down her spine. "What is it?" she called as Jacob reined in his horse near the edge of the clearing. Jacob's jaw was tight, his gaze scanning the horizon. "Cattle's been spooked, maybe rustlers, maybe a wild predator. We need to check the northern pasture before nightfall." "Grab Lily and stay close," he instructed, urgency lacing his tone. Clara's heart leapt. She had faced hard work and the loneliness of the ranch, but she had never been in a situation where danger lurked so close. Yet the little spark of determination that had driven her these past weeks surged again. She nodded, gathering Lily's hand and guiding her back toward the cabin, even as her mind raced with worry. As night began to descend, the rustling of the grass in the wind seemed to carry a new, menacing sound, footsteps perhaps, or the soft clatter of hooves. Clara waited near the cabin, keeping a careful watch, her thoughts drifting constantly between concern for Jacob and the safety of Lily. When she heard Jacob's firm voice calling from the northern pasture, followed by the low, wary grunts of the cattle, she clenched her hands, silently praying that he would be all right. Meanwhile, Jacob worked quickly, corralling the restless cattle and scanning the horizon. His pulse raced as he spotted faint figures moving near the tree-lined strangers on horseback, their intent unclear. Rustlers were not uncommon in this part of the country, and he knew he had to act decisively. Clara's image flitted through his mind, her concern, her laughter, the gentle way she cared for Lily, and he realized he could not afford to fail tonight. Clara, hearing the distant sounds, ran toward the pasture's edge, waving a lantern. "Jacob, over here!" she called. Her voice was steady despite the fear she felt, and when Jacob saw her, a flash of relief crossed his face. She had come not just out of curiosity, but with a courage that mirrored his own. Together they managed to drive the cattle away from the danger and back toward the barn. Lily, kept safely inside the cabin by a neighbor who had been alerted earlier, waited anxiously, clutching her doll. By the time the last of the cattle was secured and the intruders or perhaps predators had been scared off, night had fully settled over the ranch. Jacob, breathing heavily, allowed himself a rare moment of gratitude. Clara stood beside him, dirt-smudged and exhausted, yet her eyes shone with determination and pride. He realized then that this shared challenge had changed something fundamental between them. It was no longer just mutual respect, they had become a team, relying on one another in ways that transcended mere convenience. Later, as they tended to the barn and secured the animals for the night, Lily slipped quietly into the stable doorway. She had witnessed none of the danger directly, but she sensed the shift. Running to Clara, she threw her arms around her. "You helped Papa today," she whispered. "You really belong here." Jacob watched the embrace, the warmth in Clara's eyes, and felt the protective walls around his heart soften further. The threat of the outside world had tested them, revealing strengths they didn't fully realize they possessed. And in the shared relief, the unspoken gratitude, he felt something tender stir in acknowledgement that Clara was no longer merely a guest on the Hartwell Ranch. She was part of their lives, woven into the very fabric of their daily existence, and perhaps into their hearts as well. The days following the chaos with the cattle settled into a rare calm. The sky was painted with the soft hues of early autumn, and the ranch seemed almost at peace again. Clara moved through her chores with a quiet confidence, and Jacob found himself noticing her in ways that made his chest tighten a glance. A smile, the way her hands worked with care and precision, whether feeding Lily or tending the animals. It was a subtle shift, but one that neither could ignore. It began in small, almost imperceptible moments. Jacob would catch Clara laughing with Lily in the morning light, her eyes sparkling with warmth, and feel an ache of longing he hadn't known in years. Clara, meanwhile, found herself thinking of Jacob's steady presence when she was away from the ranch, his quiet patience, the way he moved through the world with a sense of duty and unspoken strength. There was admiration at first, but it grew into something more, a pull, a magnetism neither fully understood, but both felt deeply. One afternoon, after a long morning of fixing a broken fence, Jacob and Clara paused to rest by the edge of the field. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of hay and the distant mountains, and for a moment the world felt suspended. Jacob leaned against a fence post, glancing at Clara as she wiped the sweat from her brow. He realized he was acutely aware of every movement she made, every detail of her expression. His heart thudded in a way that startled him. "Clara," he said, voice low, almost unsure, "you've done more than I expected since you arrived. I didn't think I'd see someone adapt to this place so quickly or so." "Well?" He trailed off, realizing he had left his thought incomplete, but Clara understood anyway. She smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that made his pulse quicken. "I didn't come here planning to stay forever," she admitted softly, "but now I can't imagine leaving. This place, you, Lily. It feels like home." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Jacob felt a tightness in his chest, a mix of hope and fear. He had protected his heart for so long, convinced it was safer to remain solitary. But the truth was undeniable. He wanted her here, not just for the ranch, not just for Lily, but for himself. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara helped Lily prepare for bed. Jacob watched from the doorway, the golden light catching her hair. The little girl looked up at him and then at Clara, her small hand squeezing Clara's gently. "You belong here," Lily said again, her voice full of certainty, and Jacob's resolve began to crumble. After Lily drifted off to sleep, Jacob found himself sitting on the porch beside Clara. Neither spoke at first, the silence filled with unspoken thoughts and feelings. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Clara, I don't know how this happened, or why you came to the wrong ranch of all places, but His voice faltered, the vulnerability in his tone surprising even him. Clara reached out, resting her hand lightly on his. "I don't know why either," she said softly, "but I know this. I know us feels right." In that moment, Jacob understood fully. He had fought against loneliness, against the fear of losing control over his life, and against the fragile hope that someone could fill the void left by his wife's death. But standing there with Clara, with the little girl who had bridged their hearts, he felt something undeniable of. Not the hurried, reckless love of novels or songs, but the steady, grounding love of two people who had found one another through trials, mistakes, and chance. As the stars began to pepper the darkening sky, they sat together in silence, hands intertwined, hearts quietly acknowledging the truth. Love had found them unexpectedly, in a place neither had anticipated, and yet it felt inevitable, as though the long journey of mistakes, missed connections, and resilience had been leading them here all along. The morning air carried a strange tension as Clara went about her chores. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the ranch, when the distant sound of hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Jacob, who was mending a section of the fence, immediately stiffened. He had learned to recognize the difference between the casual passage of neighbors and the purposeful gallop of someone arriving with intent. Clara noticed the change in his posture, the subtle tightening of his jaw, and her heart skipped a beat. A rider emerged from the horizon, impeccably dressed in a style that clearly marked him as a man of wealth and refinement. His horse moved with the smooth precision of one accustomed to comfort rather than rugged terrain. As he drew closer, Clara's stomach knotted with recognition. It was him, the man she had been sent to meet, the fiancé whose letter had begun her journey. "Clara Whitmore?" the man called, his voice polite but commanding. "I believe you were expected at Blackwood Ranch." Clara's hands trembled as she glanced at Jacob, who stood silently watching the scene unfold. The contrast between the two men was stark. One, the groom she had been promised, polished and orderly. The other, rugged and weathered, yet undeniably strong and protective. Her thoughts swirled duty, obligation, and loyalty collided with the undeniable pull of her heart. Jacob stepped forward, his presence steady but guarded. "She isn't going anywhere," he said quietly, his eyes locking with Clara's for a brief moment. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet, firm resolve. Clara felt the weight of his words, realizing that this choice was not merely about her past obligations, but about the life she could build here among the people who had become her family. The fiancé dismounted, his gaze assessing the ranch with thinly veiled curiosity. "Miss Whitmore, you were sent to me," he said, attempting to maintain control of the situation. The arrangements were clear. "I expect you to come with me." Clara took a deep breath, her mind flashing back to the weeks she had spent on the Hartwell Ranch, the early mornings, the hard work, the laughter with Lily, and the quiet moments with Jacob that had filled a void she hadn't realized existed. She thought of Lily's words, "God finally sent you to us," and she knew in her heart that this was not a mistake, it was destiny. I cannot," Clara said softly but firmly, her gaze unwavering. "My journey brought me here, not to Blackwood Ranch, but to the Hartwell Ranch. I belong here with Jacob and Lily. I am grateful for your care, but my place is here, where I have been needed and have found home." The groom's expression hardened, but it was clear that no amount of polite insistence could sway her. Clara's resolve was unwavering. She turned to Jacob and Lily, feeling the warmth and certainty of belonging, the family she had chosen through love and shared hardship. Jacob stepped closer, taking her hand gently in his. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted, his voice low and full of emotion, "but I'm glad the stagecoach took a wrong turn." Lily ran forward, throwing her small arms around Clara's waist. "I knew it! I knew you'd stay," she whispered, her eyes sparkling with joy. The moment was sealed not by legal arrangements, nor by the expectations of strangers, but by the bonds they had formed through trust, courage, and shared life. The fiancé, realizing his place was no longer relevant, tipped his hat politely and mounted his horse, retreating into the distance, leaving the Hartwell Ranch in peace. Clara exhaled deeply, her heart light yet full. She had faced choice, obligation, and temptation, but the answer had always been clear. Her place, her love, and her future were here on this rugged ranch with the man who had slowly become more than a protector and the little girl who had guided her heart. The morning sun rose over the Hartwell Ranch with a gentle warmth, casting a golden glow over the fields and the quiet, sturdy cabin that had become Clara's home. The air carried the scent of hay, earth, and fresh beginnings. For the first time since her long journey began, Clara felt entirely at peace, surrounded by the people who had become her family and the land that now felt like hers. Jacob was already in the barn, tending to the horses and cattle with a practiced ease, yet there was a softness in his movements that hadn't been there before. The ordeal of the past weeks, the mistaken journey, the arrival of Clara, the threats to the ranch, and the quiet growth of love had changed him. He moved with confidence, but also with an awareness that life was no longer just about survival or duty. It was about care, connection, and the family he had come to cherish. Clara stepped out onto the porch, carrying a basket of freshly baked bread. Lily ran ahead of her, laughing, her small feet kicking up dust as she chased a chicken across the yard. The little girl's joy was contagious, and Clara felt it fill her chest with warmth. She had been welcomed not as a guest, but as part of their lives, a presence that had woven itself into the rhythm of the ranch, uniting them through shared effort, trust, and love. Jacob emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, and caught Clara's eye. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the unspoken words of weeks past hanging in the air. Gratitude, respect, admiration, and the deeper bond that had grown into love. He walked toward her, reaching for her hand, and she took it willingly, feeling the steady strength that had become her anchor. "Morning," he said, his voice gentle, tinged with the quiet happiness that he seldom allowed himself to express. "Morning," Clara replied, smiling, her eyes bright with affection. She glanced toward Lily, who had climbed onto the porch railing, swinging her legs with boundless energy. "Ready to help me feed the chickens today?" she asked, her tone playful. Lily hopped down, grabbing Clara's hand. "Yes, but Jacob has to help with the cows too," she insisted, tugging at his sleeve. Jacob chuckled, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to echo across the valley. He knew, in that moment, that the three of them had formed something lasting, something stronger than any obstacle or mistake that had brought them together. Throughout the day, the ranch hummed with life. Clara worked alongside Jacob, her hands steady as she carried water and tended the garden. Lily ran from task to task, guiding her little world with a combination of innocence and confidence. The family moved together as a unit, sometimes in laughter, sometimes in quiet concentration, but always with the unspoken understanding that each of them mattered, each of them belonged. As evening approached, they gathered on the porch, tired but content. Jacob held Clara's hand, Lily curled between them, and the sky above painted the horizon in brilliant shades of orange and pink. The hardships of the past, the confusion of a mistaken journey, and the trials they had faced together seemed far away, replaced by the certainty of love and home. Lily leaned against Clara, whispering once again, "God finally sent you to us." Clara smiled, kissing the top of her head, and Jacob tightened his hold on her hand. The words that had first sparked hope were now a quiet affirmation of the life they had built together, a life founded on trust, courage, and the unwavering bonds of family. The Hartwell Ranch, once a place of solitude and hard labor, had become a sanctuary of love, laughter, and belonging. And as the three of them sat together beneath the vast starlit sky, they knew that their journey, though unexpected and filled with mistakes along the way, had led them exactly where they were meant to be, together as a new family whole and unbreakable.